Welcome to this IATA press briefing. My name is Tony Consul. I'm the head of communications here at IATA, and I'm joined by our Director General, Willie Walsh, and our Chief Economist, Marie Owens-Thompson. Today's briefing is focused on the February 22 passenger and cargo results. We'll have a short presentation and remarks from Mr. Walsh, and then we'll throw it open to questions and answers. Questions and answers are through the chat function. Please tap them in early so that they are in the queue, and we'll get to them pretty much in the order that we receive. In the interest of time, let's get started. I'll turn it over to Willie. Willie, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tony, and good afternoon, everybody. As Tony said, we have a short presentation, which I'll take you through now. So we move to the first slide, which will give you an overview of February. This is showing the February performance against February 2019. And you can see that after a short pause in January, the recovery has picked up again. Strong performance by cargo, up 11.9% versus the same month in 2019. And then you can see passenger traffic at overall 45.5% down on 2019, with international almost 60% down and domestic 22% down. And we'll just go a little bit into detail behind these figures. We move to the next slide, which shows the domestic performance. And a mixed bag. I think we've been seeing this in the domestic markets for a little while now. Russia continues to grow relative to 2019. However, we clearly would expect that to be significantly impacted in March because of the war in Ukraine. You can see the US is just about back to where it was in 2019, down just under 7% versus 2019. And then the other big domestic markets, again, we would expect China to show some deterioration in March, given the restrictions that have been imposed in Shanghai in particular. Japan down significantly at minus 65%. And the Australian market beginning to pick up as the regulations in Australia start to relax. If we move to the next slide, which shows the international performance for the month. You can see Asia-Pacific region continues to lag significantly behind other segments, given the ongoing border restrictions, although we are seeing some positive developments there. And we're encouraged by what we're hearing from some governments as well. China continues to be an outlier, pursuing the zero COVID approach. But we would expect to see a number of countries starting to relax their restrictions as we go through the rest of this month. The rest of the markets, Africa, Europe, Latin America, Middle East, and North America, are all in that sort of bracket between minus 44 and minus 52. Africa at minus 52. Europe is minus 45, Middle East minus 46, North America minus 44, and the Latin America region minus 44. All showed very strong performance in February versus February of 21. So, you saw Europe up 381%, but clearly still lagging behind where we were in 2019. If we move to the next slide, you can see here that cargo, a very good performance. We had a record February, the best February performance on record, certainly back to 1990. I was looking at figures this morning. December was the record month ever. So, good performance in cargo. We are seeing some differences across the regions, but overall, pleased to see Latin America beginning to pick up. And next slide, please. This, however, would indicate that there's, some softening likely to happen as we go forward. The PMI has gone below 50. You can see there at minus 48.1, I think it was, for the world. So we would, based on this and based on the ongoing disruption to supply chains that we're witnessing, we would expect to see the growth and very strong performance of cargo just begin to ease as we go through the next couple of months. We move on to the next slide. You can see fuel has clearly been a major challenge for airlines. And this chart actually shows a significant difference between the Brent price in red and the jet fuel price. Now, it is impacted by very high prices in the East Coast USA, which have seen record jet prices. So the global position is slightly better than the blue line when you see it if you exclude the East Coast USA. But a very significant increase in jet fuel prices. And given that fuel represents the single biggest cost base of the industry, it averaged 27% over the past, or over the 10 years up to 2019. So if you look at the sort of normal operating period, fuel represented 27% of the industry's cost base. It's inevitable that these high oil prices will be reflected in higher fares, and I've heard a number of CEOs indicate that in recent weeks. The good news, moving to the last slide, is that demand for passenger flying continues to be resilient, and we can see the international sales continuing to pick up despite all of the issues, particularly associated with the war in Ukraine. Domestic clearly has been impacted by China and Russia, two big domestic markets, and we would expect, given the restrictions that we see in China, that will continue to decline. China is the second biggest domestic market after the US. But overall, I think we're pleased with the resilience that we're seeing in international bookings, and I think that's reflected in many of the news stories we're reading now, with passenger traffic increasing as we go into the northern summer season. So I think a positive view of February, good cargo and good passenger figures, with recovery picking up again in February after the slight lull in January. And Tony, back to you for the Q&A.
Great, thank you very much, Willie. For those listening, we'll be distributing the press release and posting it on our website very shortly. That's the press releases both for cargo and for passenger performance in February. Willie gave a lot of statistics in there. You'll find the data tables and links to the economics notes in those as well. So without any further ado, we'll take some questions. We've got a few in the queue. Again, if you are planning to ask a question, please type it in early so that we can get to it in the order that it's received. The first questions we have come to us from Hong Kong, and there are a couple of questions here. Essentially, the questioner is asking if we believe that Hong Kong is moving in the right direction. There are still some mechanisms in there that are quite drastic in terms of how they deal with new arrivals of COVID. Really, the question, I guess, is, first off, how difficult do you think the situation is in Hong Kong for aviation, and do you see any potential for it to be reconnected to the global network anytime soon?
It's extremely difficult for airlines operating into or from Hong Kong. The restrictions there have been very severe and have led directly to the cancellation of a lot of services, with airlines effectively finding it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to operate there. So Hong Kong is very much an outlier. Disappointing to see the measures that have been put in place when you compare it to what's happening in other parts of the world. So we would hope that we'll see an improvement in that situation. But, Hong Kong as an international hub airport has slipped, it's effectively off the map now. And I think it's going to be difficult for Hong Kong to recover. It's going to lag significantly behind the recovery that we're seeing elsewhere, and has led to a tough time for all airlines operating there. But if you look at what's happened in other parts of the world and what we're beginning to see in Asia, maybe there's reason to be optimistic that Hong Kong will start to relax the severe restrictions that they've imposed.
Okay, thanks, Willie. And just one specific follow-up to that. The questioner says the reduction in the quarantine period to 7 days, is that sufficient to start the recovery?
No, I don't think it is. We continue to hear feedback from airlines and customers that the fact that there is a quarantine period is just so discouraging that people aren't going to travel in the current environment unless they really have to. And given that most other countries have removed their quarantine requirements, I think it's hopeful that we'll see the same applied in Hong Kong. But a 7-day quarantine period, while better than it was, is still going to significantly discourage people from traveling now.
Okay. We have a question from another part of the world in a completely different perspective. It references the UK. The question there is, why are the airports or is the industry not seem to be prepared to accept the growing number of travelers that are arriving in the UK? Will the current passenger experience on arrival put off travelers? And then the follow-up to that would be, did the UK lift restrictions too early?
I don't think the UK did lift restrictions too early. In fact, all of the evidence that we've highlighted for some considerable time points to the fact that the restrictions were having no or very little impact on managing the outbreak of coronavirus. So these border restrictions, don't really do anything. From the research that we've done, it may slow down the peak by a couple of days, but that's it. It's not going to stop the virus from spreading within the country, particularly as most of the restrictions are imposed after the virus is identified in the country. So I think what we're witnessing at the moment is the difficulties that both airports and airlines face getting people back into employment, particularly when you've got to go through very stringent background security checks. And those security checks, while clearly very important and necessary, do take some time. And in fact, the time being taken that we're hearing now from a number of countries has been impacted by staff shortages in the areas outside of the airlines and airports control where these background security checks are being done. So it's great to see passenger numbers increasing and flights returning towards where we were in 2019. But I think we are in for a short period of disruption at airports, as both airports and airlines try to ramp up their staffing to match the increasing demand that we're witnessing at the moment.
Thank you. We have a question on fuel prices. The questioner says that fuel prices are a challenge. What is the impact on airlines? Is there a risk that this could push them into insolvency as they're trying to recover from COVID-19?
Well, it clearly represents a very big challenge. As I said, fuel is the single biggest cost for most, if not all, airlines. But everybody's going to face the same challenge. So it's not really a competitive issue because most airlines have little hedging in place, or if they do have hedging, it's even at reasonably high cost. So I think the issue here is that ultimately the high oil price is going to find its way into higher ticket prices. And as I said, I've heard a number of CEOs commenting on that. It's inevitable. Airlines are not in a position to absorb the significant increase in the fuel bills that they're seeing at the moment. And this has happened before in the industry. Typically we would have said that an increasing oil price takes about 6 months to find its way through into ticket pricing. But given the very rapid increase that we have seen, I think it's likely to be reflected in ticket pricing a lot earlier than we would have traditionally seen. And that's also because, advanced sales are at a much lower volume now than they would traditionally be. So I think the high oil price is a challenge, but I don't see it as being a challenge that the industry will not be able to face, given that we've faced these sort of challenges in the past. So I think airlines know what they need to do, and will respond quickly to the challenges that it represents.
Thank you. We have a question from India. The questioner says that India is bouncing back domestically and internationally. What will the impact of the Indian recovery have on the global economy?
It's a very positive development. The Indian domestic market is a big market, and the international market, has always been an important strategic market for airlines. So I think people are pleased to see the situation developing in India and moving back to a more normal environment. So I think India is very important to watch. Clearly, the situation there has been very tough for airlines, and the restrictions that the government imposed during the period of high coronavirus outbreaks in India were very restrictive and actually unique to India. So I think the sooner we get back to a more normal, competitive operating environment in India, the better for everybody. But it's a very positive development, and clearly will be reflected in improving situations for airlines in India and airlines operating into and out of India.
Thank you. We have a question now referencing back to the staff shortages. And the questioner asks, are these short-term factors causing the staff shortages completely outside of the industry's control, or does it reflect bad planning?
No, I don't think it reflects bad planning. I think in many cases it's caused by a combination of events. Clearly airlines had no choice but to reduce their staffing during the period of the epidemic in 2020 and 2021. A lot of people left the industry. The challenge that the industry faces is bringing back frontline staff where they will require background security checks does take time. And in most cases, actually, you can't even start training these people until they've got their security clearance. Now, traditionally, from my experience, security clearance used to take about 5 to 6 weeks. I'm hearing that it's taking much longer than that now. So that represents a big additional burden for airlines and airports to face. So I know that most airlines were aware of what was going to happen and had started recruitment some months ago. But I think the challenge in getting the security clearance is completely outside of the airlines and airports control and does depend very much on the resources being available in government departments. So I would be reluctant to say that this is because of bad planning on the part of airlines and airports. I think, to be fair to them, they had little choice but to reduce their staffing during the height of the crisis, and clearly it will take time to get that back up to normal. But with the additional burden of longer delays in getting the security checks being done, I think that's completely outside of the control of the airlines and airports.
Okay, thank you. We have a question now about the war in Ukraine. The questioner asks, have we seen any changes in booking patterns for international travel since the war has broken out?
I'll ask Murray to comment on this in a moment, but it's normal when we see problems like the conflict, the war that we're seeing, for it to have an impact on people's booking. Normally, what people do is they'll pause to consider what's happening, whether it's going to impact them, whether it's likely to cause disruption to their flights. So that sort of behavior is what we would normally expect to see, and I think that's what we've witnessed during this period. But maybe, Murray, you'd like to comment on this situation there.
Sure. So, it might sound like a callous comment, and it's certainly not meant to be, as we, of course, watch daily the atrocities that are happening because of the war. But nevertheless, it is having not a massive impact on our industry. And I would say that the dominant driver of the developments in our industry is still COVID-related and restrictions-related. And the reaction that we have seen in response to the war is obviously concentrated in the country's concerns and the neighboring countries there. And it so happens that that region is not the major part of the global aviation system. We are, of course, seeing other interesting consequences, cargo, for instance, being diverted as it cannot fly over those countries, and that seems to be benefiting the Middle East, for instance, currently. So, of course, it does have an impact, but for our global outlook, it is clearly driven by the lifting of restrictions.
Thank you both. We have a questioner who asks, so he understands the passenger figures and the cargo figures in terms of traffic, but what's the financial situation like? Are the airlines expecting, have we changed, I suppose, our projections for the industry's financial performance?
Again, I'll ask Murray to comment in a moment, but we were expecting the industry to lose money in 2022 at an industry level. Now, that forecast was done when the fuel price, I think, averaged around, from memory, Murray, you can correct me, about $75 US. It's clearly much higher than that. So the fuel price will have a significant impact on the industry's costs. It would be a question then of how quickly that translates into higher fares to offset those costs. But I think looking at the situation today, and we've not yet updated our forecast for 2022, but I think it is likely to have a negative financial impact, given that, as I mentioned earlier, there is normally a lag between the increase in the fuel price and the increase in fares to offset that fuel price. Because I don't think airlines can do much to reduce other costs. I think they've done an exceptional job during 2020 and 2021 to reduce the cost base as much as they possibly can. So I think that is likely to have a negative impact on the financial performance in 22. But maybe, Murray, you'd like to comment?
Yes, there's a bit of a mystery, if I may say so, about how passengers might respond to potentially higher prices. And, normally we would think that the correlation should be negative. If fares go up, people should perhaps travel less. But we certainly have the impression that in the current environment, these sensitivities on the customer side to price increases might be lower than usual. And part of that, I believe, is potentially because fares are actually somewhat lower than they have been historically. So perhaps we need to come back to the historic price levels before this starts to impact passenger numbers, and also, just the seemingly intense desire to travel. Because as soon as restrictions are eased or removed, we see an immediate response in the passenger numbers. So the best response is what I'm trying to get to finally, to any challenge, of course, on the cost side for any business is to try to grow that business. And this is where we will have to see how quickly the remaining restrictions get lifted. But if they come off, I think that will clearly also be extremely helpful for airlines' financial performance this year.
Thank you. We have a question concerning the situation in Russia. And the questioner asks, what are IATA's business relations with Russian airlines, suppliers, and business partners?
So we have a settlement system which operates for the Russian market, which is continuing to function subject to all of the various measures that governments have put in place, the sanctions. So the situation is quite complex there. As you would expect, a lot of people would have bought tickets for travel in Russia or into Russia on flights that now will not operate. So the settlement system, which normally moves the money from the customer through travel agents to the airline, is now operating in reverse from the airlines back through the IATA system to the travel agent to be refunded to customers. And it's the reason we've kept it going. A number of Russian airlines have been sanctioned, and clearly we're not doing business with them. So we're complying with all sanction requirements. And if the sanctions change, we monitor them on a regular basis. So we will not be doing any activity with airlines or individuals or businesses that have been sanctioned, regardless of where the sanctions have been applied, whether it's the EU, the US, the UK, Canada. So we're complying with all of the sanctions that have been put in place.
Great, thank you very much. We have a question about the AGM. IATA has announced that the AGM venue will be in Doha. And the questioner asks, do we expect that that could be an opportunity for Airbus and Qatar Airways to discuss their ongoing dispute? And would IATA have or be prepared to take a mediating role in such a discussion?
So it's really disappointing that we've not been able to go ahead with the AGM in Shanghai. Clearly something we were really looking forward to, but given the measures that have been put in place in Shanghai specifically and China more generally, we felt it was impossible for us to continue to commit to holding the AGM in Shanghai. So the Board of Governors reluctantly, unanimously agreed to move the AGM from Shanghai to Doha. And that was on the back of an offer made by Qatar Airways to step in if it proved necessary to do so. So we're now looking forward to the AGM in Doha. I don't think the AGM is going to be the venue for discussions between Qatar Airways and Airbus. I think they can have those discussions at any time. And I'm not sure that they need anybody to mediate. Obviously, if people wanted us to get involved, we would, but I don't expect that to happen. I think Qatar and Airbus are well able to have direct discussions and negotiations between themselves without any interference or involvement of other parties. But I know everybody will be watching the situation with great interest, but I expect the AGM to be conducted in normal fashion. I don't expect there to be any issues associated with the ongoing difficulties between Qatar Airways and Airbus.
Thank you. Question now on the COVID situation. Questioner says, firstly, several governments are starting to remove mask mandates. Does IATA believe that it's time for mask mandates to be removed?
Yes. I think the mask mandate had a role to play at a time. The science is very clear. The air on board the aircraft is safer and cleaner than just about anywhere else you're likely to find yourself. So given that masks are no longer required in many other environments, we don't believe that masks are necessary on aircraft as well. So we are encouraging governments to review the requirements for masks. And as you know, a number of countries have already removed those restrictions, although it can be quite complex for airlines. We've seen airlines where their home country has removed the restriction, but the country they're flying to continues to have restrictions. So in that case, people are very confused as to what should apply. But I think the time has come for the requirement to wear masks on board the aircraft to be removed. As I said, I think it was a part of the measures that made sense during the earlier stages of the pandemic while people were trying to understand exactly what's going on. But given the evidence that's available to us now, I don't see that there is an ongoing requirement for people to be forced to wear masks on board the aircraft.
Thank you. We have a question specific to the U.S. market. The questioner asks if the U.S. references the expectation that the U.S. government will lift testing requirements pre-departure for inbound international travel. The question for IATA is, do we support that, and do we have any idea when that might happen?
Well, we do support it. We think it will be a great development. If the US follows the steps that have been taken in other countries where these requirements have been removed. So we're optimistic that it will happen. We know there's ongoing dialogue between the US carriers and the US government. And I think the industry would very much welcome if these restrictions or requirements were removed. So we support the removal of these testing requirements, as we've seen in many other countries. So I think it would be great to see the US fall into line with other major economies that have already removed the requirement for people to undergo tests before they travel into the country.
Thank you. We have a question about the summer travel season. Do you expect the current bottlenecks and shortages of labor to be resolved by then? How much demand are you expecting? Do you expect Asia to be open by the summer period? Willie, any thoughts on that?
So we certainly expect some markets in Asia to be open. The indications are that that will be positive for the industry and clearly will see a corresponding increase in passenger numbers. It's disappointing to see the staffing issues that we are witnessing at the moment, but personally I have a lot of sympathy for the airport and airline management teams who are trying to navigate their way through this. So, the customer experience is not what I know airlines or airports would like to offer at a time like this. There's little, if any, evidence that it is discouraging people from travel, but it clearly is an experience that people would prefer to avoid. So as we see the passenger numbers ramp up over the coming weeks and months, I would expect the problem to ease. I think some of the difficulties that we're witnessing should be resolved in the next few weeks. And hopefully we'll get back to a more normal operating environment as we get into the peak summer period.
And I guess a follow-up on that would be specifically for Europe. Are you expecting it, the summer of 2022, to be pretty much where the industry was in 2019?
I don't think we'll be back to 2019, but we're certainly seeing a very positive situation developing in Europe. It's clear, as Maury said, that customers do not appear to be put off by the increased pricing that's likely to be seen as a result of the higher energy prices. So the situation looks good for European airlines, but I don't think we'll get back to where we were in 2019 as we go through this summer of 2022. But we're certainly heading in the right direction, and that's going to be very much welcomed by European airlines who suffered a very difficult period in 2020 and 2021 with the restrictions that we witnessed across Europe.
Another question looking forward. The questioner asked about future potential waves of COVID. Do you think we've learned enough from the last couple of years that a new variant or a new wave of an existing variant will not lead to the same types of border closures and disruptions that we've seen over the past few years? Are you optimistic, pessimistic?
I'm an optimist at heart, so I would like to believe that we have learned. Certainly as an industry, we've learned a lot. And I think to give credit to everybody operating in the industry, I think the industry responded really well. What we witnessed, though, were measures being put in place by governments, which I think more reflected as I said before, the political science rather than the medical science. And I think that environment has changed as well. I don't think the mood in the general public would support the reintroduction of the strict lockdowns that we have seen in most countries. And all of the evidence that's available to us now, and we now have 2 years of evidence to support our view that these measures did little, if anything, to stop the spread of the virus. So when you look at the economic impact of the measures, the damage that was done, not just to the airline industry and the wider air transport industry, tourism, but the economies in general, I can't see governments being as willing to reimpose these measures in the face of the new variant. So I'm optimistic that we'll see a much more measured response if we do witness, or when we do witness, a new variant than the restrictions that we saw when the virus was first identified, back in 2019.
Thank you. We have a question from the Arab Gulf region with reference to Marie's earlier comments that some of the cargo flows are now going through the Gulf. The questioner asks, in general, how would you characterize the status of the aviation sector in the Gulf region at this point in time?
Yeah, I think the airlines in the Gulf are in a good position to take advantage of their geographic positioning, which has always been beneficial to the hubs in the Gulf. And when you look at what's happening with Qatar and Emirates in particular, with the very fast build-up of capacity. In fact, I think Qatar is probably one of the first airlines to get back to 2019 levels of production already. That clearly reflects the opportunity that exists, both from a passenger and a cargo point of view. So I think the situation there is definitely going to be positive for those carriers. And I know from talking to the CEOs and commercial officers in the region, they're very optimistic about the situation for 2022 and beyond.
Thank you. We have a question coming from China, and it's with reference to the China Eastern air crash. The questioner asks, do we think that the market environment could have put pressure in this area? And what advice or hopes does IATA have for the investigation?
Well, clearly our condolences to everybody impacted as a result of the tragic accident. It's very important that we wait for the investigation. There's no point in speculating as to the cause of the accident until all of the information is made available and people can analyse in great detail. So I have absolutely no doubt that we will see a very comprehensive assessment of that accident, and if lessons are to be learned, they will be learned. But I think you've also got to reflect on the fact that the safety record in China has been really, really good. And given the very high levels of growth that we've witnessed there, if I look back over the last 10 years, I think the industry, the regulator and the government has done an outstanding job to be able to grow the industry at a significant pace while maintaining a very clear focus on the safety and security and integrity of the operation there. So, as I said, I think it would be wrong for us to speculate as to the cause of the accident. We'll wait to see the results of the official inquiry, and the industry will look carefully at that. And as I said, if lessons are to be learned, I have no doubt that those lessons will be learned.
We have a question with respect to industry consolidation, specifically in the low-cost or budget sector. And the questioner references JetBlue launching a counterbid for Spirit yesterday. Do you have any comments on it?
Well, I was surprised because I had dinner with Robin Hayes last Thursday night and was with him for most of Friday. You wouldn't have expected Robin to say anything, but there was no hint of anything happening there. It clearly took the market by surprise. I think, JetBlue, very, very smart management team there. They know what they're doing. I think it's evidence that, the financial strength of the US airlines, does stand out from the rest of the world, given the way the domestic market has recovered, but also the way the US government moved so quickly to support their industry through the CARES Act. I think the government recognized the strategic importance of a healthy air transport industry in the US and did everything that was required and more, in fact, to ensure that the industry would not suffer as a result of the pandemic. So when you look at the financial health of airlines, the financial health of the US airlines, it clearly does stand out at the moment. So it's not a great surprise to see the possibility of consolidation taking place there. And I think people will watch with great interest to see how Spirit responds to the bid by JetBlue. I think we'll watch that with interest. But I think there is scope for further consolidation in the market in the US. It's the one market where I think you can clearly see the benefit that consumers have achieved through the consolidation that has taken place there. The investment in the product in the US in recent years has been very, very significant. The development of the network, particularly the domestic network, but also the international market, has benefited from the consolidation and the financial health that the industry has achieved as a result of that. So, as I said, we'll watch with great interest what happens there.
Thank you. We have another question on ticket prices. And the questioner asks if there are any examples from previous crises that the industry has been through that might help us understand the consequences of what's going on now with inflationary pressures, higher costs for fuel, lots of volatility in demand.
Well, you could look back to what happened in 2008. We witnessed very significant oil prices in 2008 up to the point of the Lehman's collapse in September 08. But I think June, July 2008, fuel was around $150 a barrel. Now it's dropped off significantly following the collapse of Lehman's. And from memory, it was down near $40 a barrel in January 2009. So the industry has dealt with volatility in the oil price many times before, and as I said, it generally sees ticket prices being adjusted to reflect the movement in the oil price. It does take a little bit of time. When I was at IAG, we used to work on a sort of rule of thumb that it would take about 6 months for pricing to reflect the change in the oil price. I think that's going to be much shorter this time round. But if you wanted to look back, that's probably the period where you could witness it most, because you saw during 2008 a significant ramp up in the price of oil up to September and the collapse of Lehman's, and then a significant decline in the price of oil. And it was, those movements were reflected in ticket prices.
Okay. Sticking with the topic of higher oil prices, we have a question about the industry's approach to achieving net zero by 2050. The questioner asks if the higher prices are going to put pressure on the activities of the industry to find sustainable alternative fuel or aviation fuels, or will it perhaps put pressure on the OEMs to build more sustainable alternatives for the aircraft they're producing? Or do you think this is a short-term situation that will not impact?
Well, I think it is short-term. Certainly, if you look at the forward curve, it suggests that the oil price will come down. And I think some of the issues we're witnessing at the moment are temporary in nature. But, I can't tell you what the oil price will be in a month or 2 months or 3 months' time. But I think the positive that I would take out of this is that there is clear momentum now behind the development of wider scale availability of sustainable aviation fuels. And I suppose you could take the view that the differential that we're seeing has reduced, given that the kerosene price is high. There's still a significant premium to pay for sustainable fuels, but that premium is smaller today than it was 6 months ago. And I think you'll also see the added benefit of the development of sustainable aviation fuels, which clearly will be very different to the current supply of oil to the industry. I think that will also help when it comes to a more stable price for fuel. Now, in the long term, as I said, we clearly are encouraged by the ongoing investment that we're witnessing in sustainable aviation fuels and more importantly, the commitment that the industry has demonstrated to their willingness to buy sustainable aviation fuels, even at the significant premium that we're seeing today. So all in all, I would see this as marginally beneficial and positive to supporting the industry's move to net zero in 2050. But I'd like to think that if we're looking at the oil price, that the forward curve would give some encouragement that we're likely to see the prices reducing in the months ahead.
Returning to the topic of Russia, the lessors have suffered with their Russian fleets in the last weeks. The question is, what is the impact of the situation in Russia on the lessors, and could that have a further impact on the rest of the aviation industry? And also, do you think that it could potentially lead towards consolidation in the leasing area?
Well, we have seen some significant consolidation in the leasing market in the past 12 months. That may well continue. It's a very active market. I think the lessors clearly have a major challenge in trying to recover the aircraft that are in Russia at the moment. I think that's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, in the short term. I'm sure everybody would like to see the situation return to normal quickly. But the leasing companies, pretty much all of them are in strong financial health. So I don't see it having a major impact on the industry there. I think consolidation was likely to happen anyway. It may accelerate a little bit of the consolidation in the market, but I don't see it, as being a factor in the longer term. It clearly will have a significant impact on risk appetite to dealing with countries like Russia, given what has happened. So I think for airlines based in Russia in the long term, it's definitely a negative development. But I think for the rest of the world, I see it as being broadly neutral. I don't know, Murray, if you have any comments that you'd like to add.
Yeah, I think, again, sort of in a similar way to the limited impact of the war on the rest of our industry, that part of the world represents, a rather small part of the total. So I think in terms of the global fleet, it represents about 3% of the global fleet. So that would totally support Willie's thought that this is perhaps a hit to these companies' revenue, but it shouldn't really be a hit to their solvency. Okay. Now, asset-backed securities, on the other hand, if I can just throw that one in, anybody investing in these asset-backed securities, I would also underline what Willie just said, that that's going to be problematic for the future in that region.
Okay, thank you. We have a question about the market for spare parts. The question says, with the number of aircraft retirements that have taken place over the period of the COVID crisis, have we seen any impact on the pricing of spare parts? And what would you see going forward?
I don't have any evidence to support a change in the pricing on new spare parts, but clearly a lot of airlines will have a lot of stock available now as they retired aircraft. Many of the aircraft that are being retired have been taken out of service completely. So, I think a lot of the spares that would have been available as a result of that will have limited benefit because they're unlikely to be able to be used on other aircraft types. But, it's not unusual for airlines to, look at both the residual value of the aircraft when they've decided to take it out of service, but then also consider what the value of parting it out would be, whether they do that themselves or get somebody else to do it. So, I think some airlines will have benefited from retirements in their fleet, but I don't think it's going to have a major impact. I certainly haven't seen any evidence to suggest that it's had a major impact, but it might be worth us having a closer look at that in the months ahead.
And sticking with the topic of spare parts, the questioner asks about the sanctions on Russia and their impact on the ability of Russian carriers to have spare parts for their aircraft. How do you see that situation unfolding? Can they keep the fleets flying? What does it mean for, I suppose, the aircraft at some point in the future in terms of resale?
Yeah, it's going to be a real challenge. They clearly won't be able to access the market in a normal fashion. So you would expect airlines to start cannibalizing the fleet to support the parts required to keep the aircraft going. If we look at where sanctions have been applied to other airlines in the past, I think it has surprised everybody at how long the airlines have been able to continue to operate without access to the normal spare parts market. I think it does have a big impact on the number of aircraft that ultimately will be able to operate. But the fleet is so large. I think in the short term they will have plenty of access to the spares that they have, or through generating spares by cannibalizing some of the aircraft.
Thank you. We have a question about industry profitability, or I suppose carrier profitability. The questioner says, with the exception of cargo operations, do you see any airlines turning a profit in 2022?
Yes, I think you might be surprised actually at the number of airlines who will record profits in 2022. Clearly a lot of airlines where they are traditionally passenger focused will have benefited from strong cargo demand. So it will be interesting to see how that impacts on profitability. As I said, we forecast at an industry level the industry to make losses in 2022. But I think within the industry, there are definitely segments of the market that will be profitable and indeed will probably see a reasonable performance in 2022 on the back of the demand that we're witnessing at the moment, both for cargo and for passengers. So, there will definitely be profitable airlines in the industry in 22, and I would expect a significant increase then in profitability in 2023.
Thank you. We've got a hard stop at 3:00 Geneva time today. That gives us about 5 minutes left. We'll try and do 3 more quick-fire questions between now and then. First question would be, has the COVID crisis had any impact on IATA's membership? Has it encouraged, for example, airlines to join?
I don't think it's been the direct reason why airlines have joined. We are seeing airlines join all the time. So, I'm pleased to see that, but I don't think that's down to the particular crisis we've gone through.
Okay. Second question is, with the AGM happening in Doha in a couple of months' time, what do you see as being the biggest burning issues on the agenda?
Well, we're putting together the agenda, which we'll disclose in due course, but I think you should expect a significant part of the AGM to focus on the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and what that means for the industry. So indeed debating some of the topics that have been raised here today, but we'll disclose the full agenda in due course.
Okay, we're making good time here, so we'll try and squeeze in one more question. Do you think that Hong Kong can be an aviation hub again?
You'd have to think that it can, but it's going to be a real challenge. I think they've lost ground to a number of other hubs who will have taken significant advantage of the problems in Hong Kong. So, it's always going to be an important market, but I think, it's not going to spring to mind with a lot of customers when they're looking at how they are traveling, unless they're traveling to Hong Kong. But considering Hong Kong as a hub option, I think has certainly slipped down the list significantly as a result of what's happened there in the last 2 years.
Thank you. And the last question is a little bit outside of IATA's normal area of expertise, but recently one airline, Condor, announced a very interesting new livery. And the questioner asks if, Willie, you would have signed off on that had you been the CEO.
No, I certainly would not. But then they probably wouldn't have asked me if they had any sense, But yeah, it's definitely generated a lot of debate. I have to be honest, I didn't like it when I saw it. So, if I was given the option, I don't think I would have signed off on it.
Super. And that concludes the briefing for today.